The Shards opens with an older Bret, looking back on the terrifying events that changed his life forever. He recalls going to a late-night screening of The Shining in Los Angeles, but instead of paying attention to Stanley Kubrick's classic horror film, his focus remains fixed on a mysterious young man sitting among the audience. The stranger is Robert Mallory, and Bret explains through narration that Robert's arrival marked the beginning of a horrifying chapter filled with secrets, paranoia, and a series of brutal murders. The episode briefly shifts away from Bret to introduce an unnamed teenage girl living alone with her dog, Shadow. She notices several unsettling details around her house. Water has mysteriously disappeared from her aquarium. Items inside her bathroom cabinet have been turned upside down, and her dog has vanished without explanation. Believing she is simply imagining things, she takes a Valium tablet and tries to relax. That night, she receives a disturbing phone call from someone who says nothing but breathes heavily before hanging up. Soon after, she notices the light near her backyard pool flickering ominously, yet she convinces herself everything is fine. The following day, while posting flyers for her missing dog, she discovers numerous notices for other missing pets. Before she can return home, a man dressed entirely in black abducts her, becoming the latest victim of the serial killer terrorizing Los Angeles. Meanwhile, Bret spends his days surrounded by his wealthy circle of friends, including his girlfriend Debbie, Susan, Tom, and Ryan. Although everyone assumes Bret and Debbie are happily dating, his inner thoughts reveal something very different. He admits he isn't sure of his own sexuality and only stays with Debbie because the relationship helps him fit into society's expectations. Ironically, he confesses that the person he truly admires is Susan, whom he considers the most beautiful girl he has ever met. At Debbie's lavish pool party, tensions quietly build beneath the glamorous atmosphere. Ryan ends his friendship with Bret after a private disagreement, leaving Bret visibly shaken. Susan notices his mood and asks what happened, but Bret avoids giving her a truthful answer before Debbie interrupts the conversation. During the gathering, Susan casually mentions that a new student named Robert Mallory will soon be joining their prestigious school. Even before meeting him, Bret becomes suspicious. Robert lives nearby and could have attended several other schools, making Bret wonder why he deliberately chose theirs. While everyone else dismisses the thought, Bret cannot shake the uneasy feeling. Exploring Debbie's house, Bret encounters her father Terry relaxing in a jacuzzi. Terry takes an immediate interest in Bret after learning that he enjoys writing novels. He encourages Bret to consider screenwriting instead, and even invites him to lunch to discuss possible opportunities in Hollywood. Their conversation is interrupted by Stephen, Terry's assistant, allowing Bret to leave before the interaction becomes more uncomfortable. As he heads upstairs, Debbie's mother Liz unexpectedly questions him about Terry's intentions, hinting that she understands her husband's inappropriate behavior. Once again, Stephen steps in and prevents the awkward situation from escalating further. Waiting in her bedroom, Debbie receives a frightening anonymous phone call similar to the one received by the kidnapped girl. The caller silently breathes into the phone before Debbie angrily hangs up. She dismisses the incident and quickly shifts her attention toward Bret, who reluctantly sleeps with her despite admitting through narration that he feels no real attraction toward her. After leaving Debbie's house, Bret secretly visits Matt, the young man with whom he shares a genuine romantic relationship. Unlike his uncomfortable encounters with Debbie, Bret feels far more relaxed with Matt. Once they're alone, Bret brings up Robert, hoping Matt has heard something about the mysterious newcomer. Matt has little interest in gossip, preferring to spend his time smoking marijuana and avoiding responsibility. Bret believes Matt has enormous potential that he's wasting, and their disagreement ultimately leads Bret to end their relationship. Although Matt acts indifferent, it's clear the breakup deeply hurts him. Before leaving, Bret notices another disturbing detail. Matt's aquarium has mysteriously lost all its water. Every fish has disappeared, and his cat Alex is nowhere to be found. Neither of them realizes these strange occurrences are connected to the serial killer's pattern of stalking victims through their missing pets. The following morning, Los Angeles awakens to horrifying news. The missing girl has been found murdered near a tennis court, while the mascot statue at Bret's school has been grotesquely covered with the remains of stolen fish. Fear spreads across the campus as students struggle to process the brutal crime. Bret briefly discusses the murders with Susan before rejoining Debbie and Tom. Their conversation is interrupted when Robert Mallory finally introduces himself. Calm, polite, and confident, Robert immediately attracts everyone's attention. However, Bret remains fixated on one question. He insists that he previously saw Robert at the screening of The Shining, but Robert calmly denies ever attending the movie. Bret repeatedly presses the issue until the conversation becomes painfully awkward. Fortunately, the school bell rings, allowing everyone to escape the uncomfortable encounter. School ends with Bret spotting Robert talking privately to Matt. Curious about the connection, Bret secretly follows Robert through the streets of Los Angeles. The pursuit turns into a tense car chase before Bret hides inside a shopping mall to avoid being caught. Inside the mall, he unexpectedly spots Robert examining a display of aquariums. Hoping to avoid him, Bret slips into a record store, but Robert is waiting outside when he exits. Robert immediately confronts Bret for following him. The two exchange subtle verbal attacks before returning to their earlier disagreement over The Shining. Robert continues denying he was ever at the screening, frustrating Bret even more. When Bret questions him about meeting Matt, Robert offers only vague answers, saying Matt simply needed someone to talk to. He then unexpectedly reveals an interest in Susan, admitting he wants to pursue a relationship with her, despite knowing she's dating Tom. Bret makes it clear he has no interest in continuing the conversation. Before leaving, Robert cryptically tells him that whenever Bret speaks to him, he's really talking to himself, suggesting Bret only hears what he wants to believe. Back at home, Bret watches a television report about the serial killer terrorizing Southern California. The media has nicknamed the murderer the Trawler because of the bizarre way victims are targeted after their pets, especially fish, disappear before each killing. As Bret switches off the television, his phone suddenly rings. The unsettling breathing on the other end sounds identical to the previous anonymous calls, strongly suggesting that the Trawler has now chosen Bret as his next target. Bret struggles to cope with the horrifying murders taking place across Los Angeles. Besides the Trawler, another violent group known as the Riders of the Afterlife has also become active. Their crimes are marked by blood-drawn pentagrams, causing confusion among investigators as the media begins mixing up the two killers' crimes. Living alone while his parents are away in Europe, Bret feels constantly paranoid, imagining someone lurking inside his empty house whenever he hears the slightest noise. Trying to distract themselves from the frightening news, Bret hosts a double date at his home with Debbie, Susan, and Tom. During their gathering, Susan reveals that another teenage girl, Julie Selwyn from Marymount, has gone missing. Debbie assumes she simply ran away, but Susan quickly changes the subject by announcing that Principal Croft has asked her to organize a welcome party for Robert Mallory. She explains that Robert had a troubled past and was even institutionalized before moving to California. Debbie and Tom immediately sympathize with him, while Bret becomes even more suspicious. He insists Robert has been lying ever since denying they met during a screening of The Shining. His friends dismiss the accusation, believing Bret is overreacting. As everyone relaxes in the hot tub, Bret suddenly feels like someone is watching them from nearby. The uneasy sensation refuses to leave him. When the conversation returns to Robert, Bret tells the group about being followed by him at the shopping mall. Susan surprises him by revealing that Robert told a completely different story, claiming Bret had actually been following him. The contradiction only deepens Bret's frustration. The following morning, Bret wakes with a hangover after spending the night with Debbie. She casually tells him that Matt had called, asking Bret to stop contacting him. Bret is stunned because he never made any such calls, raising the possibility that someone has been impersonating him. Meanwhile, Debbie argues with her mother Liz after discovering her expensive makeup has been taken without permission. Liz questions whether Bret truly cares about Debbie, suggesting he doesn't seem emotionally invested in their relationship. Debbie refuses to believe her mother and confidently insists that Bret genuinely loves her. Later that evening, Bret accompanies Debbie to the grand opening of a fashionable nightclub connected to her father's business. While Debbie socializes with guests, Bret wanders through the club and unexpectedly discovers Robert sitting alone in a private lounge. Robert casually jokes that Bret probably thinks he followed him there before revealing Debbie herself invited him. The conversation quickly becomes uncomfortable when Robert mentions Matt and hints that he knows about Bret's recent falling out with him. Bret denies anything unusual happened, but Robert subtly suggests that Bret had become too attached and pushed Matt away. He then shifts the conversation towards Susan, openly admitting he intends to seduce her despite knowing she is already dating Tom. Bret finds Robert's confidence unsettling and leaves more convinced than ever that something is wrong with him. Unable to ignore Robert's growing influence over Matt, Bret drives to Matt's house. Matt immediately accuses Bret of repeatedly calling him and breathing silently into the phone. Bret denies making any anonymous calls, but Matt refuses to believe him. He also reveals that someone stole his pet fish and painted a blood-red pentagram over one of his posters. Bret insists he had nothing to do with any of it. Trying to understand Robert's involvement, Bret asks about their earlier meeting. Matt explains that Robert simply introduced himself and claimed their families had mutual connections. However, Robert also asked several strange questions about Bret, making Matt uncomfortable. Bret begs Matt to stay away from Robert, but Matt instead tells Bret to stay away from him. When Bret attempts to kiss him, Matt rejects him completely, insisting their relationship never meant anything serious and accusing Bret of acting irrationally. Heartbroken, Bret leaves in tears as their secret romance comes to an abrupt end. Several days later, Bret meets Debbie's father Terry for the lunch they previously arranged. Terry praises Bret's writing ambitions and encourages him to adapt his novel into a screenplay. Their discussion about films and literature initially appears professional, but Terry gradually steers the conversation in a more personal direction. He questions Bret about his relationship with Debbie before bluntly asking whether Bret is attracted to both men and women. Terry even asks if Bret has ever been involved with Tom. Shocked by the invasive questions, Bret ends the meeting as quickly as possible. Before he leaves, Terry asks him not to mention the conversation to Debbie and promises that Stephen will contact him about working together on a screenplay. Later in the week, Bret meets his friends at Hamburger Hamlet, only to discover Robert has already become part of their group. Susan arrives with alarming news. Matt Kellner has disappeared. Bret hides his true feelings by pretending Matt was merely someone who occasionally sold him marijuana. Susan explains that Matt has been missing for several days, and his parents only realized something was wrong after discovering he hadn't attended school. While everyone discusses the disappearance, Bret notices Robert smiling slightly, an expression that immediately raises his suspicions. Robert also casually reveals personal information about Bret's parents being overseas, despite Bret never telling him, leaving Bret wondering how Robert learned so much about his private life. At school, Ryan asks Bret whether Matt's disappearance could be connected to the riders of the afterlife. Bret disagrees, believing the trawler is responsible even though the killer's known victims have mostly been teenage girls. Shortly afterward, Susan reports another disturbing discovery. Matt's backpack has been found abandoned in Crystal Cove State Park, and traces of blood were discovered on his identification card, making it increasingly likely that he has become another victim. Meanwhile, Bret returns home to find a cassette tape addressed specifically to him waiting in his mailbox. Curious and uneasy, he plays the recording in his bedroom. What he hears leaves him horrified. The tape contains Matt's terrified voice pleading for mercy while a deep, menacing voice forces him to eat his own pet fish. The unseen captor repeatedly injects Matt with LSD and orders him to continue. Overcome with horror, Bret stops the tape and rushes to the bathroom, vomiting as the horrifying realization sinks in. Someone wanted him to hear Matt's suffering, and it appears the trawler is now communicating directly with him, bringing the nightmare frighteningly close to home.